From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., Call on Congress. The program discussing national issues that affect Oklahoma. Your host, U.S. Representative Tom Cole.
Thank you for joining me today for another edition of Cole on Congress. Today we're privileged to have with us a special guest from the great state of Virginia, Congressman Frank Wolf. Serving his 14th term in the House of Representatives, Frank is one of the most respected members of the House from either political party. In addition to the great job he does representing his Northern Virginia constituents, Frank is known for his leadership on issues relating to international human rights. Congressman Wolf serves as the co-chairman of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, and in this role he's spoken out on behalf of persecuted people around the world and worked to bring issues such as government corruption, AIDS, famine, and human rights violation into the light. He's gained a unique first-hand perspective by traveling to Ethiopia, Rwanda, the Sudan, and many other countries in Africa. He's also worked to call attention to the human rights abuses and religious persecution in the People's Republic of China, Tibet, Kosovo, and the Middle East. We're honored to have him here with us today to discuss the issues and share his seasoned insight. Congressman, it's really very, very good to have you here.
Glad to be with you, Tom.
Well, good. Normally when we're talking about these things, we talk about domestic politics, we talk about energy or agriculture and other things, but don't spend as much time, frankly, as we should on issues like human rights violations and some of the things that go on around the world where our country can have an impact. It's pretty unique. You've spent as much of your career focusing on these issues as you have. What first got you interested in this kind of issue?
In 1984, the famine was taking place in Ethiopia. And as you know, former Congressman Tony Hall, who's a Democrat, is my best friend. We were the best friends in Congress. He called me and said, you ought to go to Ethiopia. And so I got on a plane by myself and flew to Ethiopia. And finally got on the World Vision plane. It was a Twin Otter that went up that the BBC camera crew had used to break the story. And we went in a camp up in Alamata where people were dying, and I asked if I could spend the night. And they allowed me to spend the night, and rain came. Mother Teresa actually had a camp next to the World Vision camp. Rain came, and we were marooned there for several days. And so I went around with a doctor, a Dutch doctor named Peter, and I was his assistant, and I just got so involved, and every morning there were dead bodies that you would pick up and take out, and so it was kind of a life-changing experience. I had never actually been out of the country other than Canada once before I got elected to Congress. So that trip that really Congressman Hall asked me to go on was sort of a life-changing experience that got me interested in these issues.
Well, I know you've been to the Sudan multiple times during your career, and obviously one of the great human rights catastrophes that's going on right now is the situation in Darfur. Give us some perspective as to what the causes and the magnitude of the challenge is, because I frankly think most Americans simply don't have much grasp of it.
Well, it really begins, I've been to Sudan five terms. First time was in 1989. A lot of these problems emanate out of Khartoum. During those days that you would go there, Hezbollah had training camps. Hamas had training camps. Osama bin Laden lived in Sudan from 91 to 96. When they overthrew the Sadiq Mahdi government, this guy named Tarabi came in, the National Islamic Front. And that's when the North-South, 2.1 million Christians and some animists and Muslims in the South were killed by the North. Everything, what actually happened on 9/11 really came out of Khartoum. So many things. You now have in Darfur, which is right on the border of Chad, and I went there with Sam Brownback. We were the first two members of Congress to go there. You basically have genocide. You have over 400,000 people that have been killed. We would go into these camps and talk to moms and dads, and there's a group there called the Janjaweed, which are men on horseback, devil on horseback, and they ride on camels and horseback with guns The Sudanese send over the high altitude bombers they call Antonov. They're Russian bombers. They bomb the villages. They come in with Soviet Hind helicopters. They gun the people down. Then the Janjaweed come in on horseback and kill the men, loot the village. They rape the women. And over 2.5 to 3 million are now in these refugee camps where there's animal feces, human feces, and it's Muslim against Muslim. And I think the American people should feel proud because our country, the American taxpayer, pays for about 85% of the food that goes in there. But the UN stood by for the longest period of time. Kofi Annan did nothing. Now the UN is very engaged, but for 4 years, and of course the UN stood by and allowed the genocide to take place in Rwanda. And before that, they allowed the genocide to take place in Srebrenica. And up until this new fella coming in, they had allowed the genocide, real genocide. I mean, not just one person killed, real genocide being taken place. The day we were there, the next day, Mom and Dad with 2 girls come up to me and Sam Brownback. Both of the daughters had been raped the day that we got there and had been raped about a kilometer from where we were. So that is the genesis of all this evil that we now see taking place. And unfortunately, China has the largest embassy in Khartoum, and China supplies the Sudan government with weapons, with guns, with helicopters, and is the #1 supplier of oil to China. So China could stop the genocide, and yet they have refused to stop the genocide and have threatened to veto any of the resolutions that President Bush has put forward at the UN.
Well, what are the types of actions that our government can take? I mean, one, you see people urging direct military intervention. Obviously, you want to provide humanitarian support, but in a practical sense, particularly if you have another great power stifling you at the UN with a veto on the Security Council, what are the options available to our country?
Well, I think there are a lot of options. One, I got to say, the Bush administration has done a good job. They've done more than any other one. Perhaps not enough, but they have. And I know the president cares deeply about this. When you talk to him, he's passionate on this issue. I think there are things that we can do more, though. I think we should have a no-fly zone. Now, what happens, these Antonov bombers come over, and I was in a village once when they come over. Everyone is just fearful. They run. Well, when these Antonov bombers bomb, if we then send a message that 30 minutes after they land, we're going to come in with a missile and blow them up. The Soviet Hind helicopters literally come in with these Gatling guns that just rip people apart. If we say a Hind helicopter comes when it lands, we will take it out. That no-fly zone would do so much to raise the comfort level of the people. Secondly, additional sanctions. There are about 20 companies, mainly Chinese, a couple of Burma companies, that are doing business aiding the Khartoum government. I mean, they actually, in essence, help. So the disinvestment, and the Congress has passed a bill in the House, not in the Senate, to provide for disinvestment. All of the stocks in our pension plans that are owned by these Chinese companies that are aiding the Khartoum government, we disinvest and sell them. So there is a lot that we can do, and I know you've been in, and many of us have been in the Holocaust Museum, where we all said never again. The world stood by from 40 to 45. Now basically the world has stood by for the last 4 years. Up to the last couple of months, the UN is now involved. So there's a lot that we can do.
And I understand there's an African peacekeeping force there, but evidently too small to really be able to do much of anything.
Right.
Are there even facilities to operate? If you're going to operate a no-fly zone, obviously you have to have basing rights someplace in the area. It's pretty complex, although we certainly did it successfully in Iraq for a decade.
Right. Well, there are 6,000 African Union forces. They have very, very few supplies, very few helicopters, very few four-wheel drives. They're basically, they don't have very much equipment. Secondly, your point is well taken. Before you can put in the 27,000 UN peacekeepers, the so-called blue helmets, you need water and places like that. Chad has that opportunity. The French actually have several bases on the Chadian border that we could use. But every time we get an agreement, and the president has appointed Andrew Natsios, former head of AID, to negotiate these, the Khartoum government keeps moving the goalpost and moving it back. But you're right, it takes water, it takes different basing, but there is the opportunity to do that if the Khartoum government would allow us to do that. I do not favor putting American boots on the ground, because It is the most rugged country that you could ever imagine, and Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden has threatened American soldiers. I mean, I just don't think we can put American troops there. But there are now 27,000 UN peacekeepers from various countries ready to go. There is the money that we have appropriated here in the Congress. Others have appropriated. The French government is now very much with us. Under Jacques Chirac, they were opposed to us. This new fellow, Sarkozy, is very much, and their foreign minister was the head of Doctors Without Borders, who have done an amazing job there. So there are things that we could do now would make a tremendous difference, but every time we come close, the Khartoum government says no.
Well, let's go to the Chinese part of this particular puzzle, too, because you laid out, obviously they have stakes here in terms of energy supplies. They've got a relationship with the existing government. I actually heard in another context our ambassador, Christopher Hill, who's headed up our efforts in the Six Nation talks, make the point that China is now a great power and it has to act more. Sometimes they have a problem, connecting their economic interests with their responsibilities, quite frankly, as a great power. What progress have we made in persuading them to use the considerable influence that they have, to persuade the Sudanese government to be cooperative?
Very little. One, you have to look at China. One, they're worried about the 08 Olympics. They've actually hired Steven Spielberg, who did that great movie Schindler's List, to be their public relations director to help them put this great Olympics on. Today in China, if you're Catholic, there are Catholic bishops, 5 Catholic bishops in jail in China. If you're Protestant, there are hundreds of Protestant pastors in jail. If you're Muslim, there are Muslims in jail. If you're Buddhist, they have plundered to Tibet. Tibet is no longer a Tibetan country. Lhasa is no longer a Tibetan city. It's mainly a Chinese city with a Patala and things like that. So they have a very bad record. Now, 4 months ago, the president of China went to Khartoum, and everyone was very excited, thinking he was going to put pressure on the Khartoum government. And what did he announce, Tom? He announced he was going to build them a new palace. And so they have just failed to do that, and they built the pipeline. They got almost all of the oil coming out. They furnish them with money. They furnish them with the, money for the Antonov bombers. They furnish them with money for the Soviet Hind helicopters. They buy weapons so the Khartoum government can give to the Janjaweed. And so they really have not done almost anything at all. Quite the contrary, they've been the enabler for the Khartoum government.
Well, who can, obviously, as you say, we've made our position clear on this. We've done a lot, maybe not enough, but considerable amount. Who might the Chinese listen to in terms of world opinion? Their European role here?
The Europeans and now the French have been very good. The new government has been very, very good. The Germans have not been very good. But I think if we were all together to put sanctions on the Khartoum government, just like we put sanctions on other governments, I mean, when the genocide took place in the former Yugoslavia, we had sanctions on different people with travel bans. If we say no one in the Khartoum government can travel, no one can come to the United States for health care, we should disinvest any Chinese companies that are doing business propping up the Sudan government. Also, a no-fly zone. We have that ability, and every time we come close to implementing it, they say, okay, we're ready, and then they sort of go, and then 2 or 3 months from now, they kind of like Charlie Brown, the ball comes away, and they pull it back, and so I just think it's one of the greatest moral issues that we are facing, the genocide of 450,000, mainly women, the raping. What happens, Tom, is in these camps, the people have been there for 4 years. And outside there are the Khartoum, the Sudanese military that guard it, and the police. They get up early in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning. They go out, and when you're camping, you've been at a place camping, the longer you're there, the farther you have to go out to pick firewood. So they go out. They're raped in the morning. All around these camps, the Janjaweed on horseback and on camel rape them. Now, they try to go out so early with so many women that they can pick up the wood and come back. But the story of rape, death, and so it's all taking place in real time, and the world knows it. I think what's going to happen in 10 years from now, people say, the world stood by. They stood by in Rwanda, they stood by in Srebrenica, and I hate to say it, but the world stood by during the Holocaust, during World War II. But I think it's one of the biggest moral issues that we're actually facing. And these are Muslim against Muslim. So it isn't Christian against Muslim or Muslim against Christian. It's Muslim against Muslim.
Wow. What about, we've got a range of issues, obviously, with the Chinese. You mentioned a number of them. On the other hand, obviously, they're an extraordinarily important trading partner for us. We've tried to work together in North Korea with evidently some measure of success, where they have been very helpful. And I think we all recognize it's not in our interest to be in a military confrontation with a great power. How do we deal with China going forward on these types of issues? Because they have an enormous ability to do good or ill in the world now.
I would say the model would be the way that Ronald Reagan dealt with the Soviet Union. Very strong, but yet speak, engage, trade. But not only religious persecution, you can go to China now for $55,000 and get a kidney. If you needed a kidney transplant, they take your blood type. You stay in a nice hotel. It's bizarre. They then take that blood type, they go into the prisons, and they find somebody. Maybe he's a Catholic priest, maybe he's a dissident, or maybe he's a pickpocketer. They pull him out and they shoot him. I have the pictures. I can show you. If anybody from your district wants to see them, we can give you the tape. They gun him, they shoot him, they brace him up, they shoot him so they can take the kidney, the cornea. They then put that body in a automobile. They take it to and they transfer it from that dead body to somebody from the West. $55,000. They're spying on us. I mean, what they're doing to our high-tech industry, as the FBI came before my committee for 6 years, they have a much more sophisticated spying effort than did the KGB. And I think the Ronald Reagan approach, trust but verify, clearly we want to go to war. Most of the Chinese people agree with us. They're good people. I mean, Christianity is exploding in China. I mean, the Catholic Church is expanding. The evangelical church is expanding. The people are good people. It is the fundamental top government, if you will, and so they're allowing economic freedom but very little political freedom. I think we can do the same thing that Ronald Reagan did, Radio Free Europe. Now with the internet, the opportunities, there are ways of changing that government without us getting into any altercations. Certainly we don't want to go to war or be in fighting with anybody. Ronald Reagan never fired a shot. But Ronald Reagan, with many other presidents before, brought down the Soviet Union. We had the USIA, Radio Free Europe, exchange programs. And every time an American congressman or administration person would go to China, the first thing they always talked about was human rights and religious freedom, and then they got to trade. We have to do the same thing. When our members go, we talk about human rights, religious freedom. We should adopt prisoners of conscience. We should get the Catholic bishops' names. So every member raises the 5 bishops, or every member raises a human rights dissident. Then the Chinese get the message. America cares about this. So I think the way to do it is the way that Ronald Reagan did it.
You alluded in your remarks, obviously, to the extraordinary economic growth there, a relatively free economy. Do you think they can sustain the current political system that they have with that kind of economic growth, diversification, sophistication spreading through their society?
I do not. Man does not live by bread alone. I mean, I think this thing will come collapsing down. I think there is such a hunger. A lot of the Chinese dissidents, when they come through my office, there's a hunger for freedom. I mean, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. There is a hunger, and I think the Chinese almost found Ceausescu from Romania's playbook and are running those plays. I think we'll wake up someday and begin to see something dramatic taking place. But for a period of time, there will. You're going to see major crackdowns during the 2008 Olympics. They're arresting people. They're arresting people on the internet. They're arresting reporters. So no, I don't think they can sustain this. I think economic freedom, which there's plenty of. I mean, the karaoke bars, the restaurants, the hotel. But I think the personal freedoms will end up changing dramatically the government. And so we should be on the side of those who want to change, the way that we were on the side of those who wanted to bring about human rights, religious freedom in the Soviet Union, in Romania, and Poland, and Bulgaria, and places like that. And as of now, I don't think we're doing that the way that the Reagan people did in the 80s.
Well, our focus so much right now as a country is on Iraq and Afghanistan, obviously, and I think particularly in terms of public attention. But, you're talking about Darfur, you're talking about China. There are other places in the world that you see where there are particularly egregious abuses that the United States ought to be more engaged in. And frankly, how are we doing in the areas that, again, people aren't watching as closely? How would you rate our governmental performance across the board in sort of advancing human rights and trying to be an advocate for the ideals that we profess as a country?
It's a mixed picture. I think the president, if you listen to his inaugural address, he quoted Sharansky, and I think he feels very strongly. I think as you filter down in different agencies, it is a mixed picture. And obviously, I don't mean this as any criticism, when you're fighting the war in Iraq and fighting in Afghanistan, that does sort of take a lot of the time. But it's important to remember there's a book out called Arms for Jihad that the Saudis are trying to shut down. That shows that all of this whole effort, what took place in Afghanistan, what's now taking place, really came out of Khartoum. The National Islamic Front, Osama bin Laden lives there, Hamas is there, Hezbollah is there, the training camps are there. When all the Mujahideen left after the defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, most of them came to Khartoum, to Sudan. So sometimes these things are interrelated. But I think the president's heart's in the right place. I just think there's been a failure to deliver as you go down into the agencies.
Let me ask you a little bit about another area you've worked on. It's legislation I voted for, a lot of people voted for, and that was the Vietnam human rights legislation that you've been a principal sponsor and mover on. Give us some sort of update on human rights in Vietnam. That's a country we're beginning to have trading relations with, and we've tried to expand our diplomatic ties to. And it's obviously a country that Americans have a very troubled and mixed history with.
Well, almost the same pattern taking place there is taking place in China. There are 1.5 million to 2 million Vietnamese that live in our country. Great citizens. I mean, they love our country. And we've tried to get the American ambassador in Vietnam to invite them over for conferences the way that Reagan used to do. We've asked the American ambassador, he's refused, in Vietnam to have the American embassy to be an island of freedom to the Catholic Church is under great pressure there. A lot of Catholic priests have been arrested. The Buddhists are going through a very difficult time. Economically, Vietnam is booming. It's booming. But religious freedom, human rights, it has a failing grade. So the same problem with China, and I think partially because the State Department, I believe that our ambassadors and our embassies, as they were during Reagan and as they were during even Kennedy, and they were islands of freedom where we used to invite in all the dissidents in Bucharest and all the dissidents in the Soviet Union would come into the American embassy. And that's not happening. So economically, Vietnam's doing well, but human rights is doing very, very poorly.
It's kind of it's a new phenomenon. I mean, the old Soviet Union really was a communist state, or at least tried to be. These states, like Vietnam and China, which are ostensibly communist, have abandoned the economic portion of the communist ideology as something that doesn't work. But they've maintained this authoritarian, really totalitarian political structure, and I think it's one of the great questions in front of us, and it's a fundamental human rights question, I think, more than a geopolitical question.
I agree.
We're not in imminent danger of a conflict with China. We don't want one, and there's no reason why we would be in a military confrontation with them. Same way with Vietnam. But how do you keep the pressure on a totalitarian political regime and keep it from sliding into some sort of military confrontation?
Exchange programs, reaching out. I mean, President Reagan, God bless him, he and Gorbachev actually became very, very close friends. But Reagan always used the opportunity to speak out. We had the USIA. Every time delegations went over there. There really are no communists left in Vietnam and in China. It's a communist government, but they don't really believe in communism as Marx and Lenin. It's totalitarian, it's power, it's authority, it's control. to adopt the Reagan approach, we could wear them down. I mean, the war against communism, if you will, started at 47, 48, ended in 89. It took us a long time. A shot was never fired, if you will, but we were focused on democracy and freedom and speaking out. And Ronald Reagan, the greatest speech he ever gave was in Orlando, Florida, where he called the Soviet Union the evil empire. I talked to dissidents who were in prison in Perm Camp 35. When they heard Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire, they were emboldened. Sharansky, Sakharov, Elena Bonner, they were just, finally somebody gets it. So I think we can do it that way and change the world without firing one shot.
I know you'll recall, of course, that was also one of the speeches he was most criticized for at the time. Our own sort of intellectual lead, our foreign policy professionals, this wasn't going to be helpful.
You got a good memory. He was bludgeoned in the New York Times for that speech, criticized over and over, but it's one of the greatest speeches he ever gave.
I agree. It wears pretty well. One last question, and then because I really, you're such an expert on this. You know, there's when you're in Congress, as you know, and you're engaged in these kinds of activity, there's always a tendency for charges to come at you. Well, you're sort of doing cowboy diplomacy. You know, that's not Congress's job. You're out there engaging in diplomatic efforts. That should be left to the administration. How do you respond to those kind of criticisms when they come?
Well, I was criticized when I was elected as a Reagan robot, and I think the answer again is to take the Reagan approach. Every time we would go, I would go with members to the Soviet Union. We would meet with the leadership, but we always raised human rights and religious freedom. The American embassy in Moscow opened up for the dissidents. We would then go to the dissidents' apartments. We never sought war. We always raised it. So every time we left, they knew this was our number one concern. I think it's an oversimplification. The approach, the model, changed somewhat that Reagan did, and to some extent even presidents before, but particularly Reagan from 80 to 88 is really the model. Nobody wants war. The Chinese people love us. They want to be like us. They love freedom. And so we're not against the Chinese people. We're not against the Vietnamese people. It's that cadre at the top that we can change. The same way that, remember when Ronald Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. It's that sending that message. And now with the Internet, we can send that message much easier than we could even in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s.
Well, Frank, we're about out of time, but I appreciate your passion and want to thank you for coming today to join us on this show. I really appreciate your service quite profoundly in the United States House of Representatives. You're one of the guys around here that honestly makes a difference and has never lost the energy and the commitment to your ideals, and it's pretty easy for folks to do. You know, in his famous 1961 inaugural address, President John F. Kennedy closed his speech with these words: "Here on earth, God's work must truly be our own." Frank Wolf, you're one of the guys that lives by that. Most of us don't, but I admire you tremendously, and thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you, Tom. I'm glad to be with you.
You bet.